Good morning. Have to unmute.
Good morning. How are you this morning?
Okay.
Thank you very much for your help.
Oh,
And,
no.
you're not the recording should be paused until we start. It's 9:34. We want to use every single minute that we have. So I want to start. So the first thing I want to do is I want to thank you all for participating. And I especially want to thank those who sent material in advance, which those of you who joined us last year know I assembled into a presentation that we can use for our conversation. Oh, Charlotte is here. Charlotte, she made it. Very good. Okay, so basically this is a workshop and it's about sharing recipes and memories. And then at the end of it, with your permission, we assemble this material, and Clara, who is fantastic, who is the coordinator for Yiddish New York, she puts together a cookbook, and it'll be the 2021 Yiddish New York cookbook. And the last year's one was just wonderful. Now, because I panicked and I was worried that nobody would send me any material, I prepared myself to give a whole lecture based on my father's memories and paintings. However, so many of you sent such fabulous material that we have enough for many sessions. So I'm going to save the material that I prepared about my father for next year, and I'll give it as a full, proper lecture with his paintings and his memories and whatnot. And as we have our conversation today, if something comes up, I will definitely share it. So let me now share my screen, and I'm going to, here we go. So let me begin with my father. So I promised I would say something about Meyer. So my father was born in 1916 in Opatuf, or Upton Yiddish, and Debbie Lewis, who is here, is a Landsleit. Her family is also from this area, and he came to Canada, to Toronto, in 1934. He finished primary school. He never went beyond grade, whatever, 7 grades of primary school, a Polish public school, and he he apprenticed as a shoemaker and electrician, and in Canada he worked in a sweatshop, and then eventually he became a house painter, and eventually he opened his own paint and wallpaper store. And I started interviewing him in 1967, and I interviewed him for more than 40 years until he died at the age of 93 about 10 years ago. And in the process, towards, well, the last 20 years of his life, he began to paint what he could remember. And given my interest in food, of course, among the many topics that I interviewed him about and recorded were, of course, about food, and a lot of the paintings are too. And he calls this painting, "The Soup Pot Never Left the Stove." And it's a wonderful painting, and with many beautiful stories that go with it. But you can see, this is the way they stored their dishes on this frame. The washbank, basically the washing surface, because they didn't have running water, they had basically a barrel of water, and they washed here and they cooked from here. And then, of course, the salt cellar. I actually have one like this from Poland. And to say nothing of the wood graining on every wood surface, because he knew how to grain wood to imitate any kind of wood. And he was an interior decorator. I mean, he had a paint and wallpaper store. So these are stenciled patterns on the wall. He's got a whole story about that, and about, of course, all of the food that his mother prepared. So I will save the sort of big story of that. But since you sent me such fabulous material, we will go straight to that material. So the first thing, just a second here. So I want to start with Debbie Lewis. Now, because I was worried that we wouldn't have any material, which was absolutely an unfounded worry, I especially reached out to people that I knew were passionate cooks and bakers and had a very deep connection to the Yiddish kitchen. And one of those people, one of those persons, is Debbie Lewis. So Debbie, I would like you, if you would, to please introduce yourself and then to introduce this wonderful recipe for a bitter almond cake and the story that goes with it.
Sure, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. So my father had twin cousins, and you can see well, my father came from Opt. He was born in 1920, and he was in Opt really throughout the wartime period. He was in the Skaržisko concentration camp. He was the only survivor of his family, as the entire village of Opt was wiped out during the war. They were all taken to Treblinka, but my father survived. And he was fortunate enough to have this part of his family. It was his father's side of the family had emigrated to New York really much sooner before the war. And these two girls, I don't know if you see, there are three children in the picture. One is sort of standing with her arm, and the one above her are the twins. And then beside them is their brother, Dave. And they made it to New York, and they settled in New York. Fast forward, the war is over. My father needed a sponsor to come to America, and he was on the second ship to come to America in 1946, which was, it was called the SS Perch. So he came on the Perch, he got to America, and all of a sudden he is just embraced by family, which he really did not know very well. So the twins took care of my mother, took care of my father. And as a child, I remember they were the only people I knew who lived in an apartment building in a high rise, and of all places in Manhattan. So it was very exotic to go visit them. And coming up the elevator in the high rise, I don't know if you're familiar with Lincoln Towers in New York, but they were one of the first residents of Lincoln Towers. They never married. Their lives were very much about their friends and their connections in the community. And they cooked constantly. They were the first people I knew who had Haagen-Dazs rum raisin ice cream, which was somehow always in their apartment. They cooked a wicked brisket, and they were awesome bakers, particularly Hilda. And I have to tell you that growing up, I had a very hard time telling them apart. I don't know if you, I have a picture of them in front of me. I still can't tell the difference between them, but they were very good bakers. And this cake was something that they gave to my mother. And my mother, it became one of her specialties. Back in the day, you could get something called bitter almonds. And I don't think that you can get them anymore there. I think either they're poisonous. Barbara, you might know better than I. I tried finding them when I was in Poland. I could not. I know people often use peach pits, dried up and ground up as a substitute. I've made this cake using regular almonds, and it's just as good, but there is something about the tum of a bitter almond that, going back to 1960s, when I remember eating this cake, the flavor stays with you, and I just can't duplicate that part of it. So if anyone has a source for safe bitter almonds, I will be happy to bake this cake for them.
Well, thank you, Debbie. Actually, I think it's arson. They are poisonous. Bitter almonds, and a quarter pound of bitter almonds, definitely. But my understanding is that the pits, whether I think from apricots, peaches, that they are also bitter, but without the toxic element. And there's a whole conversation about what is almond extract made from, and but that I'll try and find that information, and we can include it maybe as a footnote, because I remember there was a whole bitter almond discussion with Eve Joknowitz a while back. But thank you very, very much. It's a wonderful story, and also I love that you have this card. Where is this card from? Whose card is this?
When Hilda and Sarah both died within a couple of years of each other, my parents and I went to clean out the apartment, and I found the view. I don't know if you can see me on your screen, but this was a file box of all of their recipes. And there are things in there that are so arcane that, I wouldn't even know where to start with them. But then there are some real gems. And so I've kept this file box with all of their hand typed misspellings. They were secretaries, but they misspelled all of their recipes. And of course, some in their immaculate handwriting of all the things they used to make.
Wonderful. So
Yeah.
perhaps for our cookbook, maybe you would take a photograph of the Kestel. Oh my goodness.
So that is Hilda and Sarah with my parents. That was taken probably shortly after my parents married in 1948.
Wow. So Debbie, if you would give us a scan of that photo and a
Sure.
photo of the Kestel of the little box,
Yeah,
that
of
would
course.
be absolutely wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. So thank you so much. I'm so
I have in my cabinet, I have absolutely no idea where I bought it. It is called Saint Lucie. Obviously bought it in Paris, Arôme Amande Amère.
Huh.
So it is an extract of bitter almond.
And does it say on the list of ingredients, bitter almond?
Ingredients, substance aromatisée adénique au naturel.
Oh
So
my
it's
goodness.
obviously a
Wow.
chemically manufactured, supposed to be the equivalent of bitter almonds.
Well, that's good to know. That
Thank
is
Anyway,
very-
it's made by Saint Lucie, and everything is in French. So I obviously bought it on a trip to Paris, where sadly I am not right now. But
Well,
anyway,
we're-
I'll send this information to Barbara. But I think a few drops of this in the regular almonds would probably give a sense of that.
Very good to know. Actually, I'm going to get to the bottom of the bitter almond question and include Terry's information, anything else I can find, because it would be very, very nice to capture that flavor. So Debbie, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, so now Fagala. Now, Fagala last year brought out her mother's recipe Kestel, also a box full of recipes. And this year, several months ago, I reached out to Fagala and I asked her if, because her mother was a wonderful cook and a baker and has a lot of really old school kind of recipes. And I asked her if her mother had a recipe for Hamantaschen that was not made with baking powder, because we're going to get there in a moment. But I have a bee in my bonnet about Hamantaschen, and don't get me started. But let's go to Fagala. Fagala, first of all, tell us about Hinda, about the Kestel, and about the Hamantaschen.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. This is the Kestel. And the Kestel came to me after my mother died. She died just about 6 years ago today, on the 28th of December in 2015. My mother was from Vilna. I think being from Vilna defined her life in very many ways. And my mother came full circle in her appreciation and connection to Vilna. She was born there as a young girl. Her parents later decided to move to Vids, a small city not too far from Vilna, where they also had family. On both sides of the family, there were bakers. And her father decided that Vids would be a nicer place than a big city to raise a small family, and that he would have a good business opportunity with a bakery. And so he moved his young family to Vids to start this bakery. And sadly and very tragically, he died very, very young, leaving my Baba, his wife, with two small children in Vids. And so my grandmother took over that bakery in Vids. And when my mother was about 12 or so, my Baba decided that it would be best for my mother to go back to Vilna for her schooling, because my mother seemed quite bright and quite interested in learning, and there weren't those kinds of opportunities in Vilna, rather in Vids. And so my mother was sent back to Vilna, where she lived pretty much from the time that she was about 11 or 12, I think, like middle school and high school, through the beginning of the war, with her mother's brother and her maternal grandparents in Vilna, and she attended school there in Vilna. And then when the war broke out, at the beginning of September 1939, my Bubba was very anxious that my mother not be separated from her. And so she sent for her and brought my mother back to Vids. And that was the beginning of their very long and complicated refugee journey. But some 10 years later, in 1949, my mother ended up in New York. And although she had come from this family of bakers, baking was work. And she never really spent much time in the bakery. She never really learned how to bake at home. Her mother, much like my mother herself, her mother was involved very much as a community member, a Schultürerin, someone who was very, very engaged in actively working in the community, and somehow felt that those things were the most important lessons that she could bring to my mother. And so my mother really didn't learn how to bake until she came to the US and had to have a household and take care of her home and figure out what to put on the table. And it was with the help of a neighbor, a woman whose family had come to this country, much like Debbie described, in her family, a half a generation earlier, that my mother learned how to bake. And she became really a phenomenal baker. And I have this kestele. I realized in going through this kestele, as I've done many times because I'm organizing this work into some sort of project myself, that one of the things about it is that there are no cooking recipes. It's all baking, really. There are one or two things like my uncle's kreplach that my mother had a recipe for. Cooking was something that she just sort of did. She knew how to do it. If she wanted a recipe for something specific that wasn't in her own repertoire, there was always the New York Times cookbook or the Settlement cookbook or something else. But cooking was just something she knew. She thought of baking as something much more exact and much more precise. And she was also very interested herself in what I like to think of as sammeln, collecting recipes from others. And so many of the recipes that she has are with attribution. One or two, I have no idea who Marcia is, but Marcia's pound cake. We have several recipes for Marcia's pound cake in my mother's beautiful script. I don't know Marcia. I have no idea. My mother wrote recipes on anything that was available. This Marcia's pound cake was on a piece of paper that says, "Re-elect Assemblyman Stephen B. Kaufman." This must have been in the 1960s. We have brown paper bags, one of the very many recipes for Mandelbrot. There are probably about 20. Again, many with attribution, some without, and most with absolutely no instruction as to what one is to do with them. So the ingredients were very precise, but the instructions themselves were not. It was sort of assumed that if you knew your way around the kitchen and could turn the oven on, that you could figure it out. So as Barbara said, some months ago, she reached out to me. I think it was the middle of August. And I think my immediate response to her when she wrote me, do you have a recipe for Hamantaschen that's made with yeast? I wrote her back, Barbara, in August. And then she explained to me what she was looking for. So here's that recipe. And you can see there's this folded over card on the bottom. And that's because the other side of that card is the more standard kind of cookie dough recipe. And above it is the recipe for her poppy seed or mun filling, which is a cooked filling. It's extremely messy. So if you're going to cook the poppy seed filling, be prepared for bubbling poppy seeds all over your kitchen. But my mother was a great fan of yeast. We have yeast cheesecake, we have yeast babka, and I was glad to be able to share this with you. reminded me of a little bit of a taste of home. These were also my father's favorite. My father, by the way, was from Valsha, a completely different food tradition, and my mother learned to embrace both. But this was something that he was especially fond of. Thank you.
Fegula, thank you so much. So let me explain why in August I reached out to Fegula for a yeast dough Hamantash. So basically at Polin Museum, we are going to open in March an exhibition called in Polish Od Kuchni, in English What's Cooking, about Jewish food. And I had to write an essay for the publication, for the catalog, for the exhibition. And I was assigned one of 4 sections, and it was the section on transformations. And I don't know, oh, I know what happened. So what happened was that earlier for Purim, I basically, my childhood memory of Hamantash is it was always with a yeast dough and the pocket was closed. There was no little opening. And I didn't understand what happened to that traditional yeast dough Hamantash. And what I discovered is that the great transformation in Jewish baking happened with the advent of baking powder in the second half of the 19th century. And that once baking powder was introduced, it drove out yeast in many, 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 many baked goods. And there's a whole book called basically about what's called the baking powder wars. And there were 4 big main baking powder companies. There were actually more. And they aggressively marketed baking powder so that at the beginning of the 20th century, the Settlement House cookbook had baking powder in just about everything. So baking powder became more reliable, quicker. So it was really for what are called to this day quick breads. And essentially the cookie dough, I mean, I would have to look further, but the certainly in today, and I think for the better part of the 20th century, the cookie dough version of the Hamantash is its own story. I know that Terry Edelstein and I have had a running debate on the cookie dough Hamantash, and I'm sure Terry will chime in when we get there, because we have some cookie dough Hamantash coming up. But the yeast dough, I knew I could count on Hinda, on Fegula's mom, for a yeast dough Hamantash. And in fact, in some of the more traditional cookbooks, even like ones from little paperback ones that were published in the 60s, they provide both recipes. They provide a cookie dough one and also a yeast dough one. But in any event, the baking powder story was what I wanted to get to the bottom of. And so that was why I reached out to Fegula. So thank you very, very much, Fegula. So Terry, so first of all, Terry, I know that you're very fond of, and you were a great defender of the cookie dough Hamantash, to my dismay, my utter and complete dismay. So I'll let you comment on that before we go
agree
to
on we agree on everything, Barbara, except cookie dough versus yeast dough. This, and to me, of course, it's all what you grew up with. But this recipe that I'm going to present quickly, because there are people who have much better recipes than my own, but it caused me to think about a kind of existential question, and that is, who owns a recipe and how does a recipe become your recipe? When Barbara asked me to participate, I decided my very favorite recipe with a Yiddish provenance was Mandelbrot. That is a recipe I got from my dear friend Diane Karp. It was her mother's recipe. So I wrote to Diane to say, could I share the recipe and could she tell me something more? So what I discovered, of course, is that it wasn't Mrs. Rosenberg's recipe. It was a recipe from a friend of Mrs. Rosenberg. But of course, I have made this Mandelbrot for more than 40 years. I've made it hundreds of times. So I don't know, whose recipe is it? Is it now my recipe? But in any case, I I share it with you. The woman who just spoke said she had 30 Mandelbrot recipes, and I'd love to see all of them. This is absolutely fascinating. My friend Diane said she wondered whether it had ultimately come from the settlement cookbook, and I looked it up there, and it is similar but different. Anyway, I think the recipe is certainly self-explanatory. You will see in the recipe, Barbara, did you keep all of my notes that I sent?
did. Oh, Terry, ye
So
of little faith.
you will see I added in parentheses all of my own things, both in technique and ingredients. I've never changed the basic ingredients of the Mandelbrot, but I, of course, have given lots of ideas about other ways of making it. And one of my favorite ways of making it is not with mandel, with almonds, but with walnuts, because they're softer and it's much easier to slice the warm loaf. And I was amused and touched to discover when I was talking to Diane that her mother and father's favorite iteration was with walnuts. So I thought, again, it's lovely. And Diane's father was a kosher butcher. He had emigrated from the Ukraine. I don't know exactly when, but he spoke with a Yiddish accent, her father. Her mother was born in the United States and did not. But I present this recipe just as an interesting example of the life of recipes and how the passage and sharing of recipes changes their identity.
So Terry, that is a really beautiful story. I mean, these recipes have yichus. They have a genealogy. And what's really lovely here is the sort of network of relationships that are connected to how these recipes move and then take root in different kitchens. And what's lovely, like with Feigelas, and I think that's true also with Debbie's collection of recipes, is the attribution that the recipes get identified as, you know, Malka's Mandelbrot or Mrs. Rosenberg's, or even if she got it from somebody else who got it from somebody else. But that is also a way of remembering these people, that they are remembered in relationship to these recipes, which are not just on pieces of paper, but they actually come to life every time you actually make them. So it's a beautiful story. And also I should say that this detailed recipe is very Terry, who is a marvelous baker and a very adventurous baker and a very precise baker who is always tweaking, modifying, and perfecting whatever that recipe is. So Terry, thank you very, very, very much. Thank you. Now, Jeanette, oh my God. So I reached out to Jeanette because I have noticed on Facebook that she is I would say, not only a passionate cook, but a prodigious cook and baker who not only, you know, has a huge repertoire, but knows how to bake in enormous quantities. So I reached out to Jeanette and I got back an absolute gold mine of wonderful, wonderful materials. So Jeanette, I have incorporated almost everything that you sent me. And I thought you might like to introduce your mom, and then I will take us through some of the material, and I encourage you to tell us a little bit more. So tell us about your mom.
Okay, so my mom was born in Shedlitz, the daughter of the Partzler Rebbe, who had a hoif there, and a hoif is like a court, and everything was very royal, and everything was the most polished silver, the most lovely crystal, everything was the highest order, and he was treated like a king. And when he died in 1933 or 34, they moved to Warsaw, and they had a pension on Gensha, and the museum sits on top of that street in my grandmother's house, where my mother learned how to cook for massive amounts of people. And then when the ghetto was formed, they opened a soup kitchen there. So she learned how to cook massive amounts. She escaped from the ghetto with the help of my father and her brother, the Munkacherov, ended up in Munkac and Budapest, and I'm sorry, Max is getting all excited. And she landed on the Cosmo transport, eventually landing in Israel, and then met my father again after the war in Paris, came to America and started life as cooking in a hotel in New City. And she eventually became the mikveh lady in New Jersey, where she also began to start cooking for the community, because the mikveh house was also a place where you could have a bar mitzvah or you could have a small collation, things like that. So she was always cooking and baking and baking and cooking. And my father was, hold on a second. Dale, could you get Max out of here, please? Thank you. So I watched her, and we used to go to Bungalow Colony, and I wanted to bake like my mother. So we went out blueberry picking one day, and I decided I was going to make a blueberry cake while they were playing gin rummy or whatever it was they were playing under a tree. And needless to say, it was barely edible, but it was my first attempt. And then as I grew older, you know, the malchus stick of my mother's household on Shabbos and Yom Tov, she was very involved with the Aguda. And you see here the Neshei Agudas Yisrael International Mini Cookbook. What I didn't send Barbara was 44 pages of recipes. Ruchi Rosenbaum's recipe, Etu Friedman's recipe, Chaya's recipe, this one's recipe, that one's recipe. And like the other recipe, how to put them together isn't necessarily on those little bits of paper, brown paper bags, Devorah's Tel Aviv chocolate cake, you know, from Israeli note paper, all this kind of stuff. It's all on my computer. I could send it all to you, Barbara, afterwards. But, you know, I picked out what I liked. And then I ended up with my second marriage, married to the people who owned the Peter Pan Bakery in Forest Hills. Does anybody here remember the Peter Pan Bakery in Forest Hills with the black and white cookies and the chocolate cheese rugelach and the chocolate twists and the challah and the marble rings? And I mean, a typical Jewish style bakery. And when we moved to Teaneck, we decided to open up the kosher virgin. So we opened up Fibbleberries, and things were flying out the door, especially the chocolate rugelach. And after 10 years, we closed the bakery and went into publishing because it was a lot easier on our health. And then people started hacking me. Well, we want the chocolate cheese rugelach. And I remember, like 10 years after the bakery closed, I'm in a parking lot in New York, underneath the Grace Building, and a guy has this Maserati with Jersey plates. And I go, cool car from Jersey. He goes, yeah, I'm from Teaneck. I go, you're from Teaneck? Ever hear of a bakery called Fibbleberries? He goes, what does that have to do with you? I said, well, my husband and I used to own it. He said, do you still make the chocolate rugelach? And the guy I was with almost fainted because he couldn't believe people were still talking about the chocolate rugelach 10 years later. And the thing is that I have old neighbors who moved up here to the Poconos a few months ago, and they asked me, are you baking rugelach?
Well,
So-
actually, I have your rugelach here, but let me ask you a question. Why is this this little basically community cookbook? Why has it got this sort of a Chinese or Asian kind of style? International mini cookbook. How do you explain that?
I think that whoever designed it, and if you look at it, it says compiled by Chaya Sachim. Can you read it? Fogel. Yeah. Okay. So I think that there was a trend then for things chinois, although half of this looks more Japanese than it does chinois. And I guess they have some recipes in there, you know, like an Irish recipe. You see the little Irish girl, and a Dutch recipe. You see the little Dutch girl.
Oh, I see. It's international.
It's an international cookbook because I think what a lot of these basically Holocaust survivors did when they came to America with these recipes, they would get Good Housekeeping magazine, and they would try to internationalize their Yiddish cooking. and stuff like that. I mean, what I wrote a little story for Barbara, and like I'm all over the place with this. Oh yeah, that's a page from the cookbook, and that's my mother's rugelach compared to my rugelach. And
Okay, actually, that's really interesting because I think we've got some other rugelach recipes as well. There seem to be a lot of them, but oh my God, a pound of butter, a pound of cream cheese, and a pound of flour. It sounds like a pound cake. And then on hers, hers is quite different.
yes,
Hers is really different.
yes,
And how do have you ever made hers?
no, because my sister just sent this to me, so I'll give it a shot. But this is the one we made in the bakery. So
Okay.
so where I have a pound of butter and a pound of cream cheese and a pound of flour, my husband had 10 pounds of butter, 10 pounds of cream cheese, 10 pounds of flour, and and just a little bit of confectioner's sugar. And that is a very, very sticky dough. And you have to, and the way I figured out how to do it, instead of putting it in the freezer in a lump and then waiting for it to defrost enough, I would take a sheet pan, lay down a piece of parchment paper, and then push the dough down as flat as I possibly could. So when the time came to roll it out, I only had to roll it out a little bit.
Right.
Very hard to roll because it's a very soft dough once it gets, warmed up. So I do it on a marble slab. Yeah. And I roll them lengthwise, I don't do the triangles because that wouldn't work. The dough is too thin. And I roll them lengthwise and I cut and then I chop them. You can't see what I'm doing with my hands. The screen's too small. But I chop them into pieces that size. They go into the oven for about 18 minutes, depending on your oven. You have to watch, especially up in the mountains. You never know what the air pressure is going to do and what the air, the temperature, the weather, all have an effect on what you cook. So, and bake, especially bake. So you watch them, and when they start turning a little bit at the bottom, golden brown, is a good time to pull them out. You don't want them cooked too thoroughly because they turn into rock otherwise. And you get them out, you let them cool down, and then you take, I use Caloubet chocolate, and I mix it with the milk chocolate bits and the bittersweet bits, and I melt them in the microwave, and then I take my fingers and I like this. You
Wow.
Ruzzle them with your finger.
Wow. So,
And that's my mother's gift. Well, that's the gefilte fish I learned how to make from my mother.
but listen, you made it in a loaf and sliced it. You didn't make balls?
No, I didn't make balls. My mother also rolled it because it was easier when you have 20 people or 40 people. It's much easier to make the loaves and then just slice them. And
Well, I also remember a carp in the bathtub when I was growing up in downtown Toronto. And for those who are listening in, we're going to include these stories and images in the cookbook. This, of course, is this story that Jeanette's already told us about her mom and the mikveh. And this is the sweet peppery gefilte fish without the fish soup or carrots. Well, we would have had, my mother would have made it in balls, and my mother was from Brest-Litovsk, so she was, which is now in Belarus. So she's a Litvak, and she would put a little strip of the skin of the fish from the fish steaks. She'd put it around the edges so that it would look as if she had stuffed the fish.
which makes it gefilte fish.
Which makes it gefilte fish. Okay. So you had mentioned that you come from a real Hasidic family and that the table would be set with all of the best, dishes and silverware.
Yeah.
And that was always a big table with a lot of people, and with gefilte fish, chicken soup, chopped liver, stuffed cabbage, Lokshen kugel, potato kugel, cholent, and cholent kugel. What's cholent kugel? Oh, is it that kugel inside the cholent?
It's the kugel inside the cholent. You take oil, you take flour, you take a lot of paprika, you take garlic, and it's sort of like a giant dumpling.
Yeah, and actually, one of the names for it is a ganef knedel.
A
A
ganef knedel? I didn't
ganef
hear that.
knedel because it's a knedel, which means it's a huge dumpling, and it's a ganef because it steals the flavor from the cholent.
That makes sense.
So it's also known as a ganef knedel, and then of course knedlach, cholopjes, and oh, incidentally, pietrishka is parsley, not parsnip. Parsnip
So
is pasternak is parsnip.
It's the one that looks like a white carrot.
Well, there are two that look like a white carrot.
There are bigger ones and littler ones.
The little ones are petrishka, well, actually, parsley root, and the big ones are pasternak, which are parsnips.
Yeah,
And
well,
they're,
chicken soup without those.
but they're not the same. The parsnips are wonderful and sweet. The pietrishka, the parsley is a little bit different. And then this is what you described as this very regal, very Chassidish. And this, reminds me of Kosher by Design, the cookbook, that modern kosher cookbook by Art Scroll, which also sets a very contemporary but very regal kind of like a banquet table for Shabbos and for holidays.
So she would make kiddush in shul, and she would have people come to the house afterwards, or she would have an affair to raise money for Nishay, or to raise money for Hachnasas Kala, and then people would all come to the house. Now, what I didn't say in this story, and the table settings were very different, is when Moshe Feinstein and Rav Aaron Kotler, and when all of those, the Gedolei Hador, would show up to have meetings with my father, my mother would put out some Eierkirchen and bring out a pot of tea, and they would sit around the table and discuss what they had to do to fix the Jewish community or create the Jewish community in Brooklyn. I mean, people ask me where I grew up. I grew up in the crucible of the community that rebirthed the Jewish community of America after the Holocaust.
Wow. So Jeanette, Terry had asked earlier in an email to me, she's looking for a really good recipe for Eierkirchelach. And so I would ask Debbie, and I would ask Fegele, and I would ask you if you have any good recipes for Eierkirchelach, if you would please send them, and we can include them in the cookbook, and we'll see what Terry thinks about them. So
I evolved.
What's that?
And then I evolved.
Yeah. Okay. So so this is Jeanette's evolution, and here is her Occupy Wall Street Schultz. So I figured this would be a good place to sort of take Jeanette's story.
So my husband and I were looking for a place to live outside of New Jersey because it had gotten too expensive. And we were moving up here when I was invited to audition for something called The Taste. So Daniel, my son, had been at Occupy Wall Street, and my daughter-in-law had made a vegetarian cholent that was very difficult. So I decided I would make vegetarian cholent for the next Occupy Judaism Shabbos at Occupy Wall Street. And I made what I called my Occupy Wall Street cholent. When I was asked to audition for this show, I made the cholent again. And I sent Barbara some links to articles that describe what the audition was like. So if she figures out a way that you can all link to these crazy things, like the actual show of me being in the audition making jalapeno Luxenkugel, or the article about how I auditioned and served the cholent. Now remember, this is Occupy Wall Street. So I served it in a crystal martini glass with a red spoon and some pico de gallo on top of it, because it was Occupy Wall Street and I wanted to be cute about it. So somebody said, she's going to get on the show. And it turned out that I did get on the show because I was being silly and ridiculous. And so I got on The Taste, and I made my my jalapeno luncheon in muffin tins because I had to cook it fast. And then I was invited to make a grandma meatloaf on the chew. And so what I did was I made a mashed potato stuffed meatloaf, mashed potato with onions and mushrooms, put it in my chopped meat and baked it off. And I lost to the lady who put the bacon in her meatloaf. And as soon as
Oh
I
my
heard she put
God.
bacon in her meatloaf, I knew I lost.
Oh my God, that is so
So
far
trendy that
from
they
a
were
vegetarian.
me mad of it.
That is so far from a vegetarian Schultz. Well, Jeanette, thank you very, very, very much. And I hope you'll send us your chicken fricassee recipe. I love fricassee. And it sounds like it'll really, really be wonderful. So thank you so, so much. Really, really appreciate your sharing this with us.
Barbara, make those links available so they can laugh.
Absolutely. We will do
They're
that.
hilarious.
Okay, well, thank you. So now I want to turn to Charlotte. So Charlotte, this is the most amazing cookbook, and it is a family cookbook. And I understand, and Charlotte, you're here, right? I just want to make sure that I can see you. This is a family cookbook, and you were the editor. So do you want to tell us something about the family and how this cookbook got started? I'm hoping that Charlotte is here.
I am. Can you hear me?
Great. Oh, yes, Charlotte, welcome. I'm so happy you were able to get on Zoom.
Yeah, I had to do my phone, so it's a little different, but
Okay, no problem.
yeah. So what happened was my mom passed away at 90, and she was the youngest of 12. They had come over from Latvia in 1909. She's the only one born in the United States. And so when she passed away, one of the things that I was looking through was the settlement cookbook that my brother and sister and I had given her in 1953. And so, like others have talked about, what was within the pages was her handwritten recipes and handwritten what she was going to have for Passover. So she'd have like her menu. Well, one of the things I noticed, of course, is there's ingredients, but there's no measurements and no instructions. So I decided to try and put a cookbook together from the family. And I wrote everybody and emailed and wrote and whatever, and had people send me their recipes. And the thing that was difficult is I couldn't get it published through any regular cookbook sites because we had no measurements and no instructions. And they all have some sort of, menu that you're supposed to follow. So I did it myself. And I got everybody to send me all of their recipes. And then I went to I live rural in rural Washington state now. And so I just found a printer across the street from me, and they were willing to put it all together for me. And anyway, so I put a little history of the family in there, and then just started putting all the recipes. Some of them, my mother never measured. So all of the recipes that I contributed basically have some measurements, not very many instructions. And then some people came behind me and did the same type of recipe, but actually in a better format. So they're all in there, lots of pictures, almost the whole family. The other thing is my cousin, Amanda Siegel, is actually her grandmother, who's 104 and still living, is my first cousin. And Amanda's the one that got me involved in this. And it's just been wonderful. And I also put together the first family reunion that I remember. We moved to California when I was 5. And so I don't remember all of the Chicago reunions that everybody had. And so for me, it was the first one. So I put it together in Chicago. And I brought all the cookbooks, and, just at cost. I wasn't trying to make any money off of it. I was able to distribute it to the family that was there. And it's just been a lot of fun, and I use it. And I don't know what else to say. There's a lot in there.
So let me ask you this. How many copies did you print?
100.
And there are, because I would kill to have a copy. So, which is probably impossible, but if anybody, if anybody was willing to part with theirs, which I rather doubt, I'm first in line. But one of the things that struck me, and I'm going with, first of all, this is the index, so you can get a sense of the range of recipes. I have a couple of observations. There are, what I love are many recipes for the same thing. Like, for example, brisket. There are many recipes, tzimmus, lots of traditional dishes, and then some of these sort of, I would say 50s, 60s kind of more suburban kind of dishes. But I did actually provide some pages here. And
There's Mom.
you want to say a word about this?
That's my mother. Yeah, her kugel recipe, which I make all the time, is another one that's kind of, there's measurements in there, but I cook like she does. So I don't follow most of it. I can tell you I'm not a good baker at all, and neither was she for that reason, I think. If, baking doesn't work as well when you don't care how much you put into anything. So we're good cooks. But her kugel was kind of famous in the family, and I still make it. And that was her with her kugel.
Yeah, and also there are a number of kugel recipes, and some of them have raisins and have other ingredients in them. But then this was one of my favorites. It's a 4-page recipe for chopped liver.
Yeah, and I can't see because it's on my phone. Is that the one that's from Billy?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's
what's lovely? I'll tell you what's lovely about this. So first of all, this is more of a telling of how to make my grandma Fern's chopped liver. As far as I know, there is no written recipe. I hope I have not offended the gods or anyone else by putting this in print. So what this is beautiful because it is how can I say, it's a recipe that's also a story. And it was hard to imagine how you could write 4 pages about how to make chopped liver, because there's another chopped liver recipe in there that's a short paragraph, less than half a page. But it's a beautiful 4 pages. And we will, with your permission, we'll try to include some of these recipes, but he gives you instruction how to make the schmaltz and everything that you could possibly want to know about how to make chopped liver. Now, the Hamantaschen, of course, this is my bête noire, but we have here Hamantaschen, and both of them, of course, call for baking powder, but they're quite different. This is your college reach out temple group, and the other one is they both are, but they're 2 different recipes. Were there? I can't remember if there's some other. I don't think there's some other Hamantaschen. Yes. There's another one from Carol.
Yeah, right. My sister-in-law.
Right. And okay, hers has pitted prunes, and yours, these 2 are made with walnuts, and this one was stuffed with it doesn't say what the filling is for the Charlotte's, the second one.
I can't see it. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So, but in any event, a walnut filling, and then a prune filling, which is very, very traditional. But this is lovely. So this is Carol and Fern, your mom, and then latkes. Oh my God, a conversation about latkes. So, but also this is again another one that's really a recipe that is in the form of a story, which is really, really lovely. And I am very happy to say that this recipe requires that you grate the potatoes, not shred them. So if I have a bête noire about baking powder versus yeast and Hamantaschen, I have another bête noire about grating versus shredding potatoes for latkes. And but this is nice because also this one I'm looking to see, you grate them, but then you mix in the eggs, but it doesn't have you squeeze out the liquid, which is another whole story. And, but it does sound, as you drain them, it doesn't really actually. And to get them to really work, I find that you have to actually squeeze out the liquid. However, I'm very happy to see that you serve it with sour cream. As for the homemade applesauce, we can debate that, but I think now this is also interesting. 2 recipes for teglach. Those are really, really old school. And
Yeah, and I made my Aunt Celia's one and it came out perfect. I was just amazed. It was
yeah, and these are 2 variations of Aunt Celia's teglach. There are two different versions of it.
right. And I can't see what you have there. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. One is submitted by Nedra Schneider and the other by Carol Ailman. And one of them calls for filberts and pecans, and the other one for ground ginger, walnuts, but you can also use hazelnuts. And
I did the ground ginger walnuts when I made it.
yeah. And one of them calls also for candied cherries. They really sound great. And I love the note from Aunt Celia. This is a good recipe. I should hope so. And then we have Nedra's gefilte fish. And here, what I find interesting is that, first of all, she's absolutely right. It has to be freshwater white fish. My mother never used carp because she said it made the fish dark. And so she always used like pike, whitefish, perch, pickerel. And here this formed as balls, and then it's simmered, which would be the way, and served with grated horseradish and beets to make it more mild. Then the stuffed cabbage, the cholishkis, which of course is another great traditional dish. And I'm looking to see, oh yes, beet borscht and pierogi and Fern's Farmers chop suey. I want to say a word of this about the Fern's Farmers chop suey. So what is, and I see this in charity cookbooks, in community cookbooks all the time. It's chopped cucumbers, tomatoes, radishes, maybe lettuce, and sour cream, salt, and pepper. Now, my mother would make this with cucumbers and radishes and scallions. Never, never tomatoes, never, ever lettuce. And then, of course, sour cream. Now, what is called chop suey in these charity cookbooks, in Yiddish, it's a blotte. And a blotte means mud. And it is a traditional Jewish dish, very popular in the summer when it's really hot, and these vegetables in the spring when radishes and cucumbers and scallions are in season, and it's a cold dish. And of course, sour cream is the cream, the Jewish cream, so to speak. So I was very happy to see these also very, very traditional recipes. So let me go back. And so anything else that you would like to add, Fern, about this cookbook? Are the other people that you gave it to in your family cooking from it?
Yes, they are. And what happened is I couldn't get it reprinted because they went out of business. And all of the places I went to, even though I have a CD of it, kept saying that they had to do all this work. So they made it so expensive that it wouldn't have been really available to the family. So what I did is I have one that I use, so it's kind of a mess. And then I do have one in black and white. I had done it in color and then some in black and white. So I have one black and white no one's ever used. And I could send that to you, Barbara.
Oh my God, it would go into my collection and be an absolute treasure. Thank you so much, Charlotte. So this is a big family, right?
Yes, very big. I can't even count them. Most of my first cousins, because my mom was the youngest and I was her youngest, most of my cousins my age, and I'm 75, are my third cousins. So we still have some first cousins left, but you know, they're pushing 90 and like I say, Blossom's 104. But there's a huge family. I mean, it's just huge. I love it. And we're all close. I mean, that's even the best part. I mean, we still talk to each other. those that are computer illiterate. We email all the time, and it's just wonderful. It's just been so wonderful for me.
Yeah, well, this cookbook is a real treasure, and it has a lot of these, especially the tzimmus. There's a plum, or like a prune tzimmus and a carrot tzimmus, and I love the variations on the recipes, and there are a lot of classic, old school Jewish recipes, and then also from the newer generation. So, Italian, Chinese, Asian kind of fusion. It's a real mix, but it's lovely the way in which people are remembering and are remembered by these recipes. And I especially love the ones that are in the form of a kind of story where the memory of the person who made the recipe is invoked along with the instructions for how to make chopped liver 4 pages. So thank you so much, Charlotte. I really, really appreciate it.